It was 9:25 a.m. on April 4, 2023. For 9.5 hours, Toby Winters had been diligently working in an underground lab, and now he was just waiting to go home at 10 a.m. The 10-month high school graduate Toby was gifted both physically and mentally, having become one of the top junior martial artists in California, and while being accepted into Stanford University. Despite all of this, Toby left that life behind. He left that life for the sake of Mayor Clark, the man who insisted that Toby should work as a scientist for him. The lab was hardly anything like Toby had imagined in June of 2022. As opposed to a white and clean lab like he'd see in movies, the lab more closely resembled a dungeon. It was about as big as a football field, and was constructed from rusting metal. The ceiling lights were blindingly bright. Toby Winters hated everything about his job, but he was assured that he was working towards something truly great. His job was to run tests on the water supply in that area, along with the minerals within that area. What Toby found in the water supply was not only interesting, but downright insane. The water in that area contained a third element to join hydrogen and oxygen. This element had gone unidentified thus far, suggesting that it was a new element. The first discovery of a new element in 12 years. The water source belonged to Freedom Miller High School, the place under which the water source resided. Mayor Clark had a meeting with Principal Jordan a day before about the water, and they made a decision which had not yet been revealed to Toby yet. Despite this, Toby had a suspicion it had to do with making money. A great deal of Toby's time at the lab was spent doing anything but investigating the area underneath Freedom Miller High. At 9:25 a.m., Toby was punching and kicking the metal wall, which was his way of practicing martial arts, until suddenly, Toby heard a loud bang. He instantly became more alert and grabbed his phone, sprinting into the elevator and heading for the main floor. The last place he wanted to be when there was an explosion was underground. The main floor happened to be the high school, where Toby saw people screaming and exiting the school in a hurry. There were 3 boys pushing a troubled-looking boy out the door. It made Toby remember the days he went to Freedom Miller, the days before the $150,000 salary. Toby almost blended in with the students. He had boyish features and a clean-shaven face. Toby was only 18, and he still had a long way to go before becoming a man. Toby casually walked out the doors of Freedom Miller High, making his way into his gray 2007 Toyota Camry. The traffic was horrid, and Toby was trying to get to his apartment, which was on the other side of the town. Toby took a right, and above the AT&T building were helicopters. Gunfire rang from inside the building, and Toby was instantly struck with the fear of God. He had nowhere to go. Cars surrounded him, and he was too scared to get out of his car. He released his seatbelt and watched the incident unfold from a distance. Suddenly, a Cadillac came rolling around the corner. It slammed into the Malco building, and a fire started. A group of people shot at the Cadillac from inside the AT&T building, and the driver was killed immediately, and the passenger was a man Toby recognized. The passenger was his boss, Mayor Thomas Clark, who began to crawl out of the burning car. The group of people came out of the AT&T building with their guns, and unloaded into Clark's head. Toby was forced to watch as his boss was slaughtered right before his eyes. Toby was only forced to watch further as the terrorists murdered the police that had arrived at the scene. The traffic jam seemed unending to Toby. It must have been 10,000 cars, all in that small area. The terrorists started shooting the cars, and Toby had to watch, defenseless, as the driver of the car in front of him was filled with lead. Toby had nowhere to go, so he slammed into the car in front of him, pressing on the pedal as hard as he could. Eventually, Toby escaped the traffic jam. He figured he may as well go down with a fight, so he drove straight at the terrorists, killing one, and driving away from the danger. Toby thought he was home free, but he heard more gunshots coming straight for him. Suddenly, the car stopped driving. Toby's tires popped, and he was now an isolated target. He opened his car door and sprinted straight into the Malco building, narrowly avoiding gunfire. Toby was cornered in the insurance building, and was forced to stop after one of the terrorists shouted at him to do so. Toby put his hands up in defeat. "If we take him to Russia, we can sell him as a slave," one terrorist suggested. The terrorists all murmured in agreement. Toby was now left in the hands of the communist terrorists. Star. It had been 6 days since the tragic events of April 4. California, especially Banco County, was slowly recovering from the terrorist attack. Things were slowly returning to normal, especially at Freedom Miller High, where the torturing of Gus Blue ensued. The school had reopened on Thursday, 2 days after the attack. Principal Jordan publicly announced, "We cannot let this great nation bow down to terrorists, which is why we're allowing students to return to school." Gus had to present evidence to Principal Jordan on Monday to prove he didn't cheat, but Gus had nothing. Rather than hopelessly finding evidence that didn't exist, Gus spent his time contemplating what he would do after expulsion. He knew that the 3 frogs would certainly be after his head, since they'd also be expelled, so he had to account for that, among many other things, such as what he'd do for a living after expulsion. His parents were thoroughly upset that their son was about to be expelled, but they believed him, so they allowed him to enroll in another Californian school online. Gus was now at school and in the principal's office at 8:30 a.m. The frog sat next to Gus as the principal stared at the students with a hint of glee in his face, as if he enjoyed what he was about to do. "So, Mr. Blue, have you come up with any evidence?" Principal Jordan asked. Suddenly, an idea popped into Gus's mind. Something he never planned on beforehand. "Principal Jordan, these 3 cheated off of my test answers," Gus cried. "They threatened my life, I swear, you have to believe me." The frogs knew this wasn't true, and they subsequently growled in frustration. Principal Jordan thought about this for a moment and said, "Sounds about right. You 3, never come back to this school." Principal Jordan just wanted somebody to expel, somebody to impose his seemingly limitless power over. The frogs said nothing, they only left the principal's office. Gus sat there for a moment, confused as to how he got out of that predicament. He'd spent nearly a week planning for his expulsion, and now he was allowed to continue. "Get out of my office, or I'll expel you too," Principal Jordan barked. Gus nodded and left the room. He was so high off his victory that he forgot about the frogs. When Gus left the office, the frogs were waiting for him outside the office. They leaped at Gus just like frogs would, and Gus sprinted away into the doors. Gus and the frogs were now outside the school, and Gus was running for his life. Star. On the 6th day of his captivity, Toby Winters awakened. He was laying on a cold hard surface, handcuffed at the legs and hands. His leg handcuff was attached to a short pole which the terrorists had implanted in the ground. Toby wasn't going anywhere, and worst of all, he was laying right next to a dead body. The terrorists, upon escaping the police on April 4, took Toby to a house, where they shot its inhabitant with a silencer pistol. They then called in someone to rescue them all the way from Russia. They never had a plan to escape originally, as it was a suicide mission which was doomed to result in the terrorists' deaths. Despite the likelihood of them dying, they succeeded in causing America's greatest or worst national tragedy, and they made it out with their lives. Toby had solely been surviving on uncooked rice and a bowl of water, and he'd been forced to eat and drink without using his hands, just like a dog. Toby refused to die like this. He thought of how little he had to live for in the moment, but how much he could achieve if he went on to survive. He yearned to watch his children grow up if he ever had them. He wanted to escape. Toby bounced his legs up and down, trying to hoist the handcuffs over the pole the terrorists had implanted in the ground. He was hungry, and deprived of anything good, but it drove him. He raised his legs in a single powerful motion, and although the handcuffs were still on his legs, he was free to scoot around. He scooted towards the dead body, which was to the left of him. He rolled over onto his side, so he could get his hands to face the dead body's hand. Toby wrapped the chain of the handcuffs around the pinky finger, and tied it. Toby pulled and tied the chain tighter. The finger broke off, and now it was time for the worst part. Toby scratched away at the finger, trying to get it down to the bone. He tore the fingernail off, and worked on the finger for an entire hour. Every second he spent was in fear that the terrorists would return to check on him. When Toby made it down to the bone of the pinky finger, he used the sharp part to lockpick the handcuffs on his hands. For the first time in 6 days, his hands were free, then his legs. It was a gruesome process, and Toby felt disgusting for doing it, but he had to. Toby drank the rest of his water properly this time and snuck upstairs. Toby heard the Russians talking in Russian and eating breakfast in the dining room. Toby looked to his left and saw a bedroom with MG42s, pistols, and knives laid on it. Toby silently loaded ammunition into a pistol, his heart beating out of his chest. He put a knife into his pocket, and slowly made his way to the dining room. Toby had never handled a gun before, and the deadly killing machine felt unnatural in Toby's young embrace. Toby walked into the kitchen, then stood against a wall, trying to force himself to do what had to be done. Finally, Toby leaped around the corner and into the dining room, removing the safety and cocking the gun. "Hands up!" Toby said hoarsely. One Russian immediately drew a pistol, and started firing belligerently at Toby. Instead of firing back, Toby sprinted into the living room, barely dodging the bullets. Toby hid behind a chair. He quickly turned around and shot a hole in the window of the door to leave the house, so that he could have an exit. The man who had shot at Toby leaned around the corner in order to cover for his terrorist comrades, who were sprinting to the bedroom, where all the guns were. Toby quickly poked his head and his gun around the chair and shot one of the men in the hip. The gunman opened fire on Toby, but he had already recoiled back to his safe position behind the chair. Toby predicted the gunman would be almost out of ammo, so he started shooting as fast as he could. While the gunman was hiding around the corner, unable to peek around due to Toby's gunfire, Toby crawled out of the window of the door he had shot, cutting himself on his thigh as he escaped. Toby was now madly sprinting out of the neighborhood, getting as far as he could from the terrorists. The Russians, scared Toby would tell the police where their hideout spot was, chased after Toby, who put his gun away in his pocket after enabling the safety to avoid anybody seeing him running around Banco County with a gun. Toby passed the Malco Insurance building, which was destroyed yet being rapidly repaired. After 2 minutes, Toby made it to a stoplight, which was red. The terrorists were right behind him, just around a corner, so Toby weaved in between cars until he made it across. Toby then turned left into a dead-end alley, where he found the frogs pulverizing Gus Blue. Toby, unaware of who these people were, drew his knife. The frogs stopped beating up Gus, whose nose was broken and whose ribs were cracked, and put their hands up. Toby was now left standing in a dead-end alley with a knife, threatening 3 teenagers with a knife, as the terrorists were just making their way across the street.